travelers, and welcome to Adventures in Security, a weekly video cast covering security news, practical tips, and things you can do to manage risk management better in your organizations. My name is Tom Olzak, and this is episode 3 for April 20th, 2014, Threats and the State of SQL Injection Attacks. Before we get started, just want to let everyone know that there will be no episode next week because I'm going in for knee replacement. So I will be out for at least that week. Hopefully the week following, the first episode for May will be published. At least that's my plan. So let's get on to what's happened this week. As we all know, the Heartbleed attack has continued to fill the news. So I'm not going to bore you with any of those things. But what I am going to talk about today is the risk that may still exist for you as you surf the web. And it's not very big. Websites have been very quick to fix this problem, but not all of them. SecureEye, according to an article by Daniel Sid at SecureEye, scanned the top 1 million sites and published on April 17th the results of that scan. Of course, they were scanning for vulnerability to Heartbleed. Of the top 1,000 sites scanned, now these are the top 1,000 based on popularity. The top 1,000 would include Google, Yahoo, Amazon.com, etc. Everybody was fixed. So of the top 1,000, or the most popular 1,000 websites, everybody's fixed. The vulnerability no longer exists. Of the top 10,000 sites, there were 53 sites that were vulnerable. That's like 0.53%. Again, the risk is extremely low, but it still exists. And we'll talk in a minute about how you might be able to use a tool to determine whether or not sites that you use, sites that you log into, are actually still vulnerable. Of the top 100,000 sites, 1,500, almost 1,600 were still vulnerable. And of the top 1 million, there were 20,000 vulnerable sites. So as the sites become less and less popular, in other words, the smaller the site, the less likely it is that it's been fixed. It appears by these statistics. One of the tools that I use, and it just came up by accident because I use LastPass as my software, as my password vault. LastPass came out with an upgrade that actually goes out and checks those sites that you use based on the passwords and site information that you put into your password vault. And it came back and showed that initially that some of my sites were still compromised. All the sites that were, and most of those sites I don't go to very often. The major sites that I use all the time were fixed. So that goes along with the statistics that SecureEye is providing to us. So I highly recommend that people use a password vault, whether you use LastPass or something else. But even if you only bring LastPass down and long enough to check your sites, that might still be a good idea. The other thing, too, about password vaults is that it's very important not to use the same password for every website. And following that guideline, it's almost impossible to remember all your passwords. Using a password vault like LastPass, and there are others, allows you to create a password for every site, not have to remember it, and to have it always available to you when you want to get onto that site. So let's move on to another report that came out. Malcovery.com posted a phished brands report. And I'm not going to go through the brands. The brands were focused primarily on the UK, but I am going to go through some trends here on phishing. And it's no surprise, shouldn't be any surprise to anybody in the security profession that there's been an increased emphasis on social engineering as a tactic. And later, as we go through the threats assessment portion of this cast, we're going to go through the 7 stages of an attack that uses phishing as its primary, phishing or watering hole attacks as its primary attack vector. And we all know that banks and other popular sites, organizations, are popular lures to get people to click on the wrong things. But growing and almost as popular with attackers are the following list. And this is these would be emails that in their subject heading have things about a court appearance, electronic fax, funeral information, personal photos. So it's not just going after the users that may or may not use the brands that are being attacked. This is going more into the advanced threats that we're going to talk a little bit about later, that are using a series of 7 steps to, including a recon, which focuses on specific users or user groups to collect information about things they're interested in, things that might be affecting them or their friends, and then using those to go after to target specific users or groups of users. So let's move on now from phishing to SQL injection attacks. SQL injection attacks are not new. They've been around since the late 90s. Because of that, and because we have solutions to SQL injection attacks and have for many years, it's surprising that at least half of the data breaches that are occurring today are the result of SQL injection attacks. Briefly, SQL injection attacks use a form or some other means of input to send a SQL command to a backend database. The primary reason or the primary weakness that allows this is lack of input vetting or input validation. If we rely completely on input validation, we're relying on developers to put in the right code to make sure that only the right input is accepted. But there are other ways. I mean, we can use parameterization, where we actually create parameters that are acceptable for specific input, and we use those over and over again. Or we can use stored procedures. A stored procedure is a routine that is stored in the database itself and is used for input and for data retrieval. So it minimizes any kind of risk from SQL injection. The other thing we have to do is we have to scan the databases looking for any unwanted data elements that have been deposited there, like routines. And we have to monitor for unusual data transfers. But those are part of what the security should be doing, just to follow up and make sure that SQL injection attacks are not a big problem for an organization. My problem with all of this is that the developers have known about all of these things for a long time. Organizations understand the risk from SQL injection attacks. And the reason I'm bringing this up today is because I want to continue to elevate awareness of this risk. There is absolutely no excuse for 50% of data breaches being caused by incorrectly vetting data that is input from a web page, from another database, from any kind of source that is allowed to access data in a database. So we need to be pushing, as security professionals, we need to be pushing for better vetting of our SQL applications and ensuring that if we find, and we can scan, it's not that difficult to scan applications looking for these kinds of vulnerabilities. One site that I go to frequently and I get a lot of good tools from is OWASP.org. That's OWASP.org. And this tool doesn't cost anything, and it will help you determine whether at least your web applications are vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. And if they are, at some point, the organization that you work for needs to address these. This is not something that can just fall by the wayside because, we're not going to worry about that. That's legacy code and we don't have the time to worry about it. Take the time to worry about it. Sell management on taking care of input validation issues. If you go up to OWASP.org and you look at the top 10 vulnerabilities, the large percentage of them are based on input validation problems, not just from users, but from other sources. Input validation is critical. All right, enough about that. I'll get off my soapbox. So this week we're going to go to part 3 and the continuing coverage of the book I'm writing. And actually, I'm staying just ahead of these casts and writing the book. And we're going to cover threats. And generally, a threat is anything that intends to cause harm to your organization. And by harm, we typically mean financial impact. So how much money are you going to lose, short-term and long-term, if a threat decides that it likes you? And so threats include intentional human behavior, which includes cyber criminals, terrorists, social activists, employees, and vendors. Unintentional human behavior, user mistakes. And this, as an aside, input validation, ensuring that your users are putting in information that you expect, accessing information that you expect them to access based on their roles, goes a long way toward helping to eliminate risk associated with unintentional or human error. Nature, acts of nature, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and geography, the geographic location of one or more of your sites. Are you in a high crime area that's subject to robbery and burglary? What's the legal environment? And political stability. So if you're a multinational company, political stability and the legal environments are very important, because in many countries, especially those where manufacturers and other organizations are moving so they can get cheaper labor, legal environment and political stability are not always things that we can count on. But threats all have one thing in common. They leverage vulnerabilities. Vulnerability is a weakness. It can be a weakness in your physical plant. It can be a weakness in your logical controls, but it's a weakness. The relevance of a threat is measured by the threat's skill set, motivation, and past activities. Natural threats have no driving motivation, nor do they need any special skills. Tornado just comes through and whacks your facility. The amount of damage they cause is based on recognizable forces, wind, water damage, etc. We can easily plan for their occurrence by examining local history of natural events. This isn't true with human threats. Human threats have different motivations and use varying skill sets to reach their objectives. Humans possess two fundamental characteristics that affect the probability that those with malicious intent will attempt to achieve financial objectives within your organization. And these two things are means and motive. I introduced the formula shown on the screen last week, and it shows that means and motive is one of the factors in a risk formula that I use for the risk due to human threats. Means represents the skills necessary for an attacker to make her way through your logical controls or physical controls. Does the person need a high level of skills in hacking routers and switches, for example? Motive is what drives the person to try to get to one of your information resources. In many cases, that is financial gain. In some others, it might be a social objective they're trying to get to try to make a point. So it's important to take into account means and motive when you're looking at likelihood of occurrence, which we'll examine next week or in 2 weeks. The traditional attack consists of 5 steps, and this is according to the Certified Ethical Hacker program. The step 1 is reconnaissance. The attacker uses various resources to learn as much as possible about your organization, including internet searches, social engineering, dumpster diving, domain name management services, and non-intrusive scanning of your network. That's non-intrusive scanning. They're just looking for what they can find by just doing a very superficial scan to see what ingress points might be available for them. After the reconnaissance step, we go to step 2, which is scanning enumeration. This is where the attacker uses any ingress points found, any weaknesses, or any social engineering opportunities to scan and identify all the potential targets that are in your network. It also she will also be looking for vulnerabilities. These are known vulnerabilities, usually, that you have not patched. The next step then is gaining access. Once vulnerabilities are identified, then she's going to use tools and techniques to gain access to one or more of your systems. Then she's going to want to maintain access, and this is going to want to be done with stealth, because in many cases, the longer that she can have access to the compromised system, the more value she's going to have from her efforts, the more return on investment she'll have from her efforts. And she's going to try to do everything she can to remain undetected. But if you have a good security information and event management program or a solution set up and you use it appropriately, it's going to be very difficult for any attacker to remain undetected. And then she's going to cover tracks. She's going to try to go into log files and remove as much evidence as possible about what she's done without also bringing up suspicions because there's too much missing from the logs. Each of these steps requires a certain level of knowledge and experience, and depends on and how difficult it is to accomplish each of these steps depends on how well you've protected your organization and how well you manage the release of information into the public domain. So as we talked about during the news part of this cast, a lot of attacks today do not use this traditional approach. They're going after users. They're relying on user behavior to compromise systems, to gain access to targets. And WebSense has come out with a 7-stage process. Now, an attacker doesn't have to use all these stages. It depends on your organization. It depends on your users. But these stages are important to understand so that you can put the proper controls, both preventive and detection controls, in place to protect your resources. And stage 1 is recon. Now, although this is the same, reconnaissance is the same as the previous process, this focuses on users or groups of users, trying to figure out what their likes are, their dislikes, the kinds of sites they go to, because this kind of attack that we're talking about is both for phishing and for watering hole. Watering hole attacks are also known sometimes as drive-by attacks, where you go up to a website and that's been a regular, authentic website that's been infected, and the minute that the user gets there and goes to the right place in the site, then the attack process, which we're going to go through here in a minute, starting with redirect, takes place. The second stage is luring the user. So in phishing attacks, the lure is usually an email, like we talked about earlier, that makes the user want to click on a link. It can also be a link at a website. A lot of times, the attackers are putting links at social media sites, for example. and other sites that users frequent, having them then be redirected, which is stage 3, to a server that has what's called an exploit kit installed on it. And that takes us to stage 4. An exploit kit is a scanner that checks the user's machine for vulnerabilities. Once the kit finds vulnerabilities, then it uses a dropper file, which is then the first malicious software that is put on the machine. A dropper file can either be a complete malware package by itself, or it can be something that is an installer that then calls another system to download the full malware package. Once the dropper file process is complete, then the malware calls home, initiates a session with the attacker's server, and gets instructions for the next steps. And usually next steps is stage 7, which is theft of data. So you can see this process is much different than the traditional process that is usually thought of when we think of an intruder trying to gain access to our network. So let's look at motive. An attacker's motive is directly related to how much effort he is willing to expend. It's all about return on investment. So suppose you are an attacker and can realize $50,000 by delivering to a buyer of credit card data. During the reconnaissance and scanning steps, you determine that it might take weeks to break through your initial target's defenses. But then you go to another target and you do a recon and you do a scanning and enumeration, and you find out that it's going to take a lot less work to get in there. You're only going to make $25,000, but you're going to be able to quickly move on to another target and make another $25,000. Which target are you going to pick? Well, chances are an attacker is going to go after that $25,000 because it's an easy, soft target. And of course, this is what many worry about with small business. Small businesses are usually soft targets. There's a trend in attacks moving to SMBs, and most of them are soft targets. So you don't get as much on the first hit, but you can do multiple hits and get the same amount of data that you would if you hit a large database. Now, that doesn't mean, as we looked at last week, databases, the mega hits, the mega breaches are growing. And so attackers are not going to just avoid enterprises because they have security in place. But there are other places for attackers, especially those with lesser means, lesser skill sets, to be able to go in and make a little cash. Political, social change, and industrial espionage motives differ significantly from those that are financially motivated. Terrorists, for example, do not care how much it costs to disrupt your system, and thus we end up with advanced persistent threats, where an attacker might stay focused on your system for weeks or months until they get in. They're not looking for a return on investment. They're looking for a social or political impact. And if your organization is important enough, provides important services, or is an organization that is controversial in some way, then they're going to continue to try to get to you regardless of cost. So that's it for threats. In a couple weeks, we're going to go into vulnerabilities and likelihood of attack. That will continue on with the series on the practical application of risk. We're also, a week after that, we're going to introduce the first tool, which will allow us to begin our process of risk assessments. These tools are available for download, and you'll be able to follow along. And I encourage you, as we walk through this, I encourage you to actually assess a system of your own. That way, when we're all done with this process, then you will actually have an actual risk assessment for a system that might or might not need attention. So that's it. Until next time, be careful what you click.